and we've called these the mind strengths, and mind is an acronym for the different strengths. So the M strength, the first of the mind strengths, stands for material reasoning, and essentially when you get right down to it, that means three-dimensional spatial reasoning. There's a great deal of evidence that many dyslexic individuals, not all, but many, enjoy advantages in lots of kinds of 3D spatial reasoning abilities. So many architects, many engineers that work in designing products that have a spatial component to them, physicists or people that work in thinking about spatial reasoning show this kind of advantage. Same for people in the construction trades, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, mechanics of various kinds. And these abilities in spatial reasoning show up in many dyslexic individuals, and they seem to probably lie behind some of the overrepresentation of dyslexic folks in training programs that have been studied in the United Kingdom, looking at engineers and designers, and in certain fields like photography as well. Some of the challenges that seem to go along with special spatial ability seem to be related to two things. One, the ability to read them in your head and to see them from all directions, so that, for example, if you've seen a car, looking at it from one perspective, you can imagine what it might look like from the top or from the back or from any other sort of side. The ability to flip things around like that often, when kids are very young, seems to be correlated also with special difficulty keeping things stable in 2 dimensions. So when we ask children that are very strong spatially and who can draw in cross-section or draw a picture for us of what a bicycle would look like from the top, they often have difficulty keeping their B's and B's and P's and Q's separated in their minds. And you can understand sort of how those things are correlated. Interestingly, when we look at children with that strength profile as well, and we examine them on tests like the WISC, the IQ test that's most commonly used with students, we'll often find that they have difficulty on subtests like block design, doing things really quickly, because they'll look at the pattern they're supposed to imitate with the little blocks, the 2-dimensional blocks. They'll look back at the blocks and they'll start spinning them back around in a circle, and they'll have difficulty fixing the orientation of the patterns that they're looking at. So that difficulty transitioning between 3-dimensional spatial strength and 2-dimensional spatial fixity, where you separate mirror images from each other, is one of the trade-offs that sometimes we see with spatial ability. A second trade-off with spatial ability is more subtle, and it relates to brain architecture. There is some research evidence that shows that oftentimes special spatial ability in 3-dimensional spatial reasoning comes because the brain incorporates certain areas that oftentimes are used for the processing of word sounds or word memory, and takes those and incorporates those and connects those with areas in the back of the brain that are often connected with visual and spatial processing. And so there can actually be kind of a borrowing of areas that are usually used for processing spatial ability, usually used for processing words or sounds, and those are turned into extra processing circuits for spatial ability. So oftentimes we'll see in people that are especially talented spatially that when they speak, they may have a little bit more relative difficulty with word finding or problems with syntax, and they may have difficulty processing the sounds in words. So there seems to be this kind of a trade-off where you're borrowing from one area of the brain to build spatial strengths, and that's part of the trade-off there. The second of the mind strengths is called interconnected reasoning, and that's basically the ability to see connections between different things, so similarities, relationships, the ability to look at things from different perspectives, the ability to take techniques that you've learned in one kind of trade or in one kind of discipline and apply those in a new way to a different discipline than the one that where they've been applied before. It's also the ability to see context or gestalt. It's big picture reasoning, the ability to spot the essence or gist of something. So when we look at abilities in this area, we often see people that are really good at spotting analogies, at spotting metaphors, people that are really good at seeing similarities between something in one field and another field, for example, people that are good at spotting patterns between events or between relationships or between concepts or ideas or physical objects as well. So the ability to notice patterns that other people miss. Oftentimes people with this kind of strength too are very good at looking at the question behind the question. So rather than just seeing on one level an issue in its kind of common context, they'll dig behind that and see a broader context or a bigger picture, and they'll see a larger strategy that may be surrounding this. So interconnected reasoning strengths can show up in many different ways. In lots of dyslexic folks, they show up as a tendency toward interdisciplinary type skills. So being, finding a trade or finding a skill, working in combining people in different areas, or building teams, or working in fields that are new, where you're combining trades or techniques that you've learned in one area to a new area. Oftentimes people that are combining insights in new ways, and this can be things like poets, or it can be things like chefs. You're taking things that have not been combined together before, but seeing interesting relationships between them and putting them together in new ways. In the book we talk about one example where an individual who had trained in biophysics and also, in physiology and also physics, combined them into a sort of a new discipline of biophysics, and then combined that with environmental science to come up with a very new way of looking at what he analogizes as being the physiology of the planet. So that ability to combine disciplines into a new discipline is a very common dyslexic kind of trait. Another thing that we see commonly in dyslexic individuals is that they'll have serial careers. So they'll start in one area and they'll work in that area for a while, and then they'll find something interesting about that area that hasn't been exploited or tried before. And then they'll take that and move into a new area. So they'll have kind of a shift in their career, oftentimes after 5 years or 10 years. At the conference we just had on dyslexic talent back in Connecticut, Professor Julie Logan from the Cass Business School in London talked about the fact that serial entrepreneurship and multiple entrepreneurship is much more common in dyslexic than non-dyslexic individuals. So individuals who start one company and are dyslexic are much more likely to start several companies than are non-dyslexic entrepreneurs. And that ability to sort of spot new opportunities and move from one area to another is a very common dyslexic pattern. Trade-offs that you can see with this kind of pattern, it's sort of we use a kind of analogy of the plate. If you get one of those ridged plates in the cafeteria where the peas are in one part and the potatoes are in another and the meat are in another, you can keep all your food separate. If you don't have those little ridges, they mix all together. You may discover some really interesting combinations between things, but you're going to have this kind of mixing. So inability to kind of keep things in their distinct place in the brain sometimes is a common dyslexic trade-off with this. So word finding, pulling out similar words or related words rather than the word that you really want, we think are related to this mixing ability in the brain. Difficulty finding the concise, succinct answer to something because you see a lot of complexity, you see a lot of secondary issues in broader context. That's something we often see in very bright younger dyslexic students. They have so many understandings of how one concept or one idea is connected with other ones. They have a hard time separating those out into different patterns. And difficulty sort of knowing where to start. So oftentimes we sort of liken this kind of cognition to seeing things as a mural where you see all the events that are connected with something at once and how they interact and interrelate rather than a linear sequence like events on a timeline. And that's a common trade-off sort of pattern for dyslexic individuals as well. The next strength pattern is end strength, or narrative reasoning. And narrative reasoning really, the way that we use it in the book, means seeing things like a story. So using story-like comprehension for things. And when you look at how the mind remembers things and remembers facts about the world, there are two ways that you can remember facts about the world. You can remember them as episodes, so you can remember them as events that have happened to you that are in context. Oftentimes you may remember where you were when you learned that fact, or you may remember some mental process that went on in your mind when you learned that fact. But there's some kind of a context to it. You may think of cases or examples or very vivid pictures that you got in your mind with that. The other kind is semantic knowledge, or dictionary definition type knowledge. So it's knowledge that's non-contextual. It's not really case or example based. It's generalization based. So all the information you have on that topic is put together in one big ball rather than stored as a lot of different episodes. The trade-offs to having narrative reasoning on the positive side, it allows you to have a lot of understanding of the full range and spectrum of difference that you can see within a particular concept. So you can see lots of different examples and go from extremes. A good example of this kind of case-by-case understanding of concepts that we talked about in the book was given to us by a naturalist named John Laws, who does field guides. And we said, when we ask you to think about a robin, what do you think about? Do you think about a generalized robin, or do you think of all the different robins you've ever seen? And he said, oh, I think of all the separate ones, absolutely. And when I did my field guides, I thought about the one robin that best represented the traits of all the group, but I didn't average all the traits together to make a single robin. The downside to this kind of thinking, of course, is that it's kind of unwieldy when you're asked for single generalized cases, or when you're asked to think about average cases or the typical case. So oftentimes for young students especially, when they have this incredible richness of imagination and they're asked to think about a particular concept or a particular thing, their mind may be flooded with all these different images and the whole variation, and they may think of extreme examples. So an example would be on a multiple choice test, where we often see dyslexic students answering no or yes to something because they're thinking of an extreme case. They're thinking of the one exception to the rule rather than the typical or the average case. And that's something that oftentimes dyslexic individuals struggle with early on. It's also sometimes hard when you don't store your knowledge as dictionary type definitions to give quick answers or brief answers to something as well, just as it is with high eye strength. So that's a kind of a trade-off that's enjoyed there. The final strength is D strength, or dynamic reasoning. And dynamic reasoning, fundamentally, it grows out of that same narrative reasoning style. It's based in personal memory, but it deals with prediction or simulation. So it's the ability to take events in your life, break them down into component bits, and take those pieces of experience and recombine them in ways that allow you to predict either future events, or if you're a paleontologist or a geologist, to combine them looking into the past to predict what might have gone on a long time ago. And that ability to recombine things is really very valuable in situations where things are changing quickly, or where the situation is entirely new and it's very different from anything you've experienced before. So we find that kind of strength being really valuable for people who work in areas like finance or entrepreneurship, or people that need to make predictions about things like farmers or ranchers, and you can't decide in advance of knowing what the weather is going to be like, how you're going to proceed. So people who can maintain a very fluid understanding of how things are going to affect them and change with that kind of changing conditions are often D-strength type people. I didn't mention with the N strengths, so particular things that are often useful from people that are very high in N strength are things that relate to stories. So it can be being a counselor, it can be being a teacher, it can be being a salesperson, it can be being somebody who works in communication fields, or fields that are related to getting across information or persuading people or changing minds. It can be in negotiation or litigation and law. So anything that involves telling a compelling story or making a compelling case. And that's obviously an incredibly valuable skill to have. So those are the mind strengths, and those are strengths that we often see in dyslexic individuals. It's rare to find a single dyslexic individual who shows all those abilities, but most all dyslexic individuals we've worked with will show one or two, and they seem to arise from the same sort of general trade-off in being able to be very good combining large elements of cognition at the expense of dealing with fine details.